Chapter 5, Death and the Afterlife. The manner in which H.P. Blavatsky presents Egyptian concepts in The Secret Doctrine is the topic of this dissertation. In Chapter 4, the constitution of the individual in the Egyptian and theosophical teachings was discussed. This chapter will examine the related topics of death and the afterlife as presented in the theosophical construction of the Egyptian religion. It is the individual who enters the afterlife states, and these topics are intimately related. Conceptions of death and the afterlife are central themes in many world religions, and theosophy and the ancient Egyptian religion are no exceptions to this rule. The two related themes of reincarnation and mummification will be touched on in Appendix 2 and 5. Many of the details of these themes are subject to debate within Egyptology, and I will contrast the theosophical statements against the mainstream academic position. The first section of this chapter outlines the classic theosophical teachings on death and the afterlife. It highlights the relevant theosophical concepts that relate specifically to H.P. Blavatsky's presentation of the ancient Egyptian teachings on these topics. This will form the background for the second section, in which we will read a series of selected readings from the Secret Doctrine on these themes. The third section of this chapter will contrast the theosophical conception against the current mainstream position of Egyptology. The primary aim remains to state reliably the theosophical position of H.P. Blavatsky on these themes as they are presented in the Secret Doctrine. I will also look to compare and contextualize her statements in the light of mainstream Egyptology and to identify where possible the sources she used and the manner in which she drew these sources into her larger theosophical scheme. The level of comparison is the doctrinal. This is the level at which theosophy operates in its engagement with world religions. In the theosophical mode of interpretation, religious statements are objective, scientific truth statements about the nature of the world and the history of humanity. Theosophy seeks to locate these scientific theosophical truths in the world's religions, a process that, on the one hand, legitimizes theosophy and, on the other, appropriates those religions into the theosophical grand scheme. This process of locating and inserting theosophical content is both rational and deliberate. 5.1 Death and the Afterlife in Theosophical Teachings. After-death states form an essential part of the theosophical teachings. The teachings are detailed and comprehensive. One, the purpose of this section is to outline the theosophical statements on the afterlife. This will form the background against which H.P. Blavatsky's specific statements on the theosophical understanding of the Egyptian afterlife can be read. The nature of H.P. Blavatsky's statements in the Secret Doctrine on most topics is fragmentary, and is meant to provide keys to various hidden meaning. This is the case with her comments on the afterlife of the ancient Egyptians. Theosophical books and articles on death, the afterlife, Devachan, Kamaloka, and numerous related themes are pervasive in the theosophical literature. I cannot here survey the field as it is simply too broad. That a reliable theosophical presentation of any topic may differ to a degree according to author and theosophical society is quite possible. The question of sources then becomes relevant. I have referred to this earlier, and I will rely on two main commentaries. The first is Barberka's The Divine Plan, which has the advantage of arranging itself around quotations from the Secret Doctrine, which is the source I am specifically assessing. The second source is G. de Pierucker's Fountain Source of Occultism, which I have found to be comprehensive and explanatory on the theosophical teachings on the after-death states. The basic content involved, as relating to the human being, is the 7 principles in the afterlife states and localities, specifically the Devachan and Kamaloka. The 7 human principles, discussed in Chapter 4 in detail, are the Stula Sarira, physical body, Linga Sarira, astral body, Prana, life principle, Kama, desire principle, Manas, mental principle, Buddha, spiritual principle, and the Atman, the divine principle. Broadly speaking, the lower 4 principles are temporary vehicles for the more permanent and enduring higher 3. As the Process of death unfolds. The lower four principles begin disintegrating and the higher three begin withdrawing into their own afterlife state, the Devachan, God land, God region 2. H.P. Blavatsky writes, the three-tongued flame that never dies is the immortal spiritual triad, the Atma Buddha and Manas. The fruition of the latter is assimilated by the first two after every terrestrial life. The four wicks that go out and are extinguished are the four lower principles, including the body. 1988, Volume 1, page 237. The following section is a detailing of the process of death as presented by Theosophy. 5.1.1 What is death? What dies? This human life and the process of reincarnation are to be seen, from the theosophical perspective, as part of a much larger evolutionary scheme. The real individuality, the monad 3, passes through all the kingdoms of life, from the mineral kingdom to the plant kingdom, to the animal kingdom, and then to the human kingdom, which is that being discussed at present. After the human kingdom, the ranges of the gods are entered. Through each evolutionary stage, the potentialities of the monad are unfolded and manifest through vehicles and bodies appropriate to that particular stage and plane of matter. This ever-unfolding and enlargement of consciousness, in all its theosophical aspects, this becoming conscious, awake, is the purpose of life. The three higher principles of the human being are immortal and do not die. At least for immense time periods this higher self is permanent and will endure. What dies then are the four lower principles. These lower principles or bodies will decompose or scatter and the higher self will withdraw into its own spheres. In a sense then, theosophically speaking, the real person or the individuality does not die. It is the personality for which is the temporary state of embodiment. The higher self manifests itself on earth through the medium of the four lower principles, the lower self in broad terms. Death is a reversal of this manifesting of the higher self on earth. Gottfried de Puracker makes an important point from the theosophical perspective, namely, that this process can be looked at in two ways. The process of dying can be looked at from the perspective of the bodies or principles, the vehicular side of the human being, or from the perspective of the informing consciousness which is embodying in the bodies which constitute the person. During the process of incarnating, or being reborn, the higher self sends out a spiritual consciousness ray which descends into more material planes. As it descends, it draws substances from the various planes to allow it to function on that plane. The substances are plane-specific matter and form the material side of the principles. These substances, composed of life atoms, were associated with the entity in previous lives and are karmically attracted back to the incarnating entity. Death then could be viewed by following the withdrawal of this ray of spiritual consciousness, in which case death would be a change of state of consciousness, or by following the dissolution of the bodies which temporarily housed this ray. De Puracker, 1974, page 539. Humanity in general is said to be in the fourth round and fifth root race. In theosophical evolutionary terms, we are busy unfolding the manas aspect of the Kama principle. Some special persons, however, for example Mahatmas and Buddhas, are said to be a number of evolutionary steps ahead of general humanity. A Mahatma may, for instance, be at that stage of the evolutionary process where the manas aspect of manas is unfolding. See Appendix 4. The locus of their consciousness resides naturally in the higher principles. Death, so to speak, is the experience of unconsciousness. General humanity is not consciously awake in their higher principles. When death occurs, the average person cannot remain conscious as this consciousness ray recedes inwards. Spiritually advanced humans can locate their consciousness in the higher principles and will not sink into unconscious states of death. They will traverse the same inner planes, but will do so consciously. 5.1.2 Causal aspects of death. According to de Puracker, death occurs for two main reasons. He writes, this mighty spiritual intellectual attraction acting on the higher part of the intermediate nature of the human constitution, combined with the wear and tear on the physicoastral compound during Earth life, are the two main contributing causes of physical death. 1974, page 540. On one hand, the higher manas, the reincarnating ego, the individuality, is, by its nature, attracted to the inner, more spiritual planes, despite embodying in the lower planes following the laws of nature. It feels a constant pull in the opposite direction. On the other hand, the higher aspects of the individual are characterized by tremendous spiritual and consciousness energy. The energy of the higher principles gradually begins to wear down the lower vehicles, and they begin to disintegrate under the strain. The three principles of Kama, Prana and Linga begin to break down under the strain of this higher energy flowing through them. The physical body then begins to reflect this inner dissolution in various ways, one of which would be the onset of disease, while another would be the aging process. Old age, then, from the theosophical perspective, would be caused by an overabundance of life energy pressing on the lower, inner principles of the person, which gradually overpowers the lower vehicles, which are the embodied person. The physical body can no longer contain or resist this overflow of life and energy. The three lower, inner principles, Linga Sarira, Prana, and Kama, begin disintegrating first, and the physical body begins to reflect this strain. 5.1.3 Process of dying, disembodying in afterlife states. In theosophical thought, the process of dying revolves around the higher principles separating from the lower temporary principles. This process is gradual and in general can be said to happen in stages and in a certain order. 5 Physical life as a fully embodied being is said to be a sphere of causes, by which is meant that it is by an embodied entity that causes and karma are generated. The afterlife states are spheres of effects, states where the results of one's thoughts, actions, and aspirations during life are experienced. Barberka, quoting H.P. Blavatsky in The Secret Doctrine 6 writes, Earth for the physical man, or the animal soul, Kama Loka, Hades, the limbo, for the disembodied man, or his shell, Devachan for the higher triad. 1964, page 393-7. As the process of dying unfolds, the physical body, Stula Sarira, is said to be easily dropped. The physical body, once the balance of the principles attached to it have withdrawn, decays and disintegrates. Its constituent physical parts will scatter into the material plane, the plane of matter. To facilitate this physical disintegration, cremation is said to be preferred. A mummification would be almost the exact opposite of this means of dealing with the corpse. Along with the body, the astral body, Linga Sarira, and the vital energies, pranas, dissipate into their constituent parts and circle through the substances of the planes to which by nature they belong. For example, the energies of the body would merge with the energies of the earth as a whole. At a certain point in the process, there occurs the first panoramic vision. In brief, during this process, the events, memories, and thoughts the person experienced during their life passes through their consciousness. The dying person will view their own life during this process. 5.1.3.1 Kama Loka, Desire World. Following Barberka's presentation, the first after-death state is the Kama Loka. The Kama Loka, literally the desire world, is a state of consciousness in which the disembodied entity resides in a vehicle or body called the Kama Rupa, or desire body. Being a loka, it can also be conceived of as a locality. As the physical, astral, and vital principles or bodies dissipate, the Kama principle in lower mind, lower manas, exists as the Kama Rupa and the Kama Loka. The period of existence in this state is dependent on the nature of the life of the deceased. A life of baser sensual pleasures and desires will suggest a longer period in this realm of desire. A selfless life of spiritual aspirations will ensure a shorter period in this particular afterlife state. This Kamarupic entity accounts in theosophical theory for many of the ghosts and other astral entities seen or contacted by mediums. This Kamarupic entity, too, will disintegrate once its time in The kama loka is expended. The kama loka, characterized by passions and lower mental aspirations, is not a desirable state in which to spend time. Instead, a swift passage into the devachan, or abode of bliss, is the state of rest and reward to which one hopes to ascend after death. 5.1.3.2 The second death. The transition from the kama loka to the devachan is preceded by the so-called second death. The intensity with which the embodied person clung to life as well as their desire for physical life and its pleasures helps determine the cohesive power of the kama rupa and the consequent stay in the kama loka. Eventually, however, the kama rupa will begin to disintegrate, and a second death is experienced, after which the entity moves to a more sublime state of consciousness characterized by the attributes of the higher, more spiritual principles. During this second death, a second panoramic vision occurs where the events of the past life filter through the higher aspect consciousness of the person. 5.1.3.3 Devachan. The second death presages the entrance into the devachan proper. The devachan is a point between two incarnations. At this point all that exists is the two higher immortal principles, the Buddha and Atman, and the higher aspects of the mind, manas, the lower bodies and impulses would have, in theory, disintegrated. In individual circumstances, the kama rupa may remain as a cohesive body for some length of time. It is, however, a soulless entity, and the real person, the individuality, has left it for the higher states to which it belongs. The Atman itself is permanently itself and does not move or go anywhere. Experiencing the devachan is the higher mind, higher manas, sometimes also called the Buddha manas, under the radiating influence of the Atmic principle. The time spent in the devachan, being a sphere of effects, is also determined by the nature of the life lived. A life of unrelenting evil, or negative thoughts, will not allow of a lengthy period in the devachan. That aspect of the person, not having been developed during life, cannot lead to a resulting positive after-death experience. In early theosophical writings, the average time between two incarnations was said to be 1,500 years, based on a factor of 100 times the average lifespan of the time. Judge 1973, page 126. Part of the nature of the devachan is described in the Mahatma letters to A.P. Sinat. There are great varieties in the devachan states. As many varieties of bliss, as on earth there are shades of perception and of capability to appreciate such reward. It is an ideated paradise, in each case of the ego's own making, and by him filled with the scenery, crowded with the incidents, and thronged with the people he would expect to find in such a sphere of compensative bliss. Barker, 1972, page 100. The psychological and subjective nature of the devachan is emphasized in this passage. The devachan is a state of consciousness, the content of the experiences being those positive ideas and images built into the higher mind by the person during life. If a person imagines paradise to be a place where one is surrounded by one's family, doing the activities one is familiar with and enjoyed during life, the after-death experience will mirror this conception. This is an important concept in the theosophical literature and its move to interpret the after-death teachings of the world religions. Whereas it may be suggested by some world religions that the person will in the afterlife actually perform the various activities expressed, for example, walking, hunting, eating, etc., in the theosophical interpretation the entity will only experience these things as mental or higher mental consciousness experiences. The devachanic state is not the highest state attainable by a human being. Nirvana is the state of the very highest principles. These highest human principles, however, are not said to die, as they never actually incarnate, and they remain on their own plane eternally aware. Devachan is also not the end of the process, as theosophical teachings present reincarnation as a law in nature. Once the period in the devachan is finished, the process of re-embodying begins. The consciousness resting in devachan is also not the full experience of the highest principles. of the individual after death. In Theosophical teaching, reference is made to the inner and outer rounds. 10 These are not revealed in detail, and I mention them briefly for completeness' sake. These teachings are discussed by G. de Pierrucker in his Fountain Source of Occultism, and I draw on this work here. As the process of dying unfolds, each principle returns to its source. For example, the physical body decays, and its component atoms are drawn into the general material plane, and so forth for the lower principles. The higher principles have more cosmic and mysterious sources. G. de Pierrucker writes, the outer rounds deal with the passage of the spiritual monad over the solar system, from planetary chain to planetary chain, and this 7 times, these 7 planetary chains being the 7 sacred planets of the ancients, and the inner rounds refer to the long manvanteric sojourn of a monad in any one of these planetary chains, during which the monad undergoes its eons-long journeys on and in and through the 7, or 12, globes of that chain. 1974, pg. 629. Following death, the human ego passes through the various globes which form the earth chain. The spiritual monad of the human, having a larger sphere of relationship, passes through or touches on the planetary chains which form the Theosophical solar system. In summary then, H.P. Blavatsky writes, here you have our doctrine, which shows man is Henry during life, a quintal just after death, and Kamaloka, and a threefold ego, spirit, soul, and consciousness in Devachan. 1987. Page 97. Each principle or subset of principles of the sevenfold individual has its own post-life destiny. The next step in the process would be that of reincarnating back onto Earth. 5.2 Death in the Afterlife in Ancient Egypt as presented in The Secret Doctrine. It is the theosophical endeavor to uncover its teachings in the various religions and philosophies of the world. I have outlined, in an earlier chapter, some of the techniques that are used to insert theosophical content into religious texts. I have sketched above a brief overview of the theosophical conception of death and the after-death states. This would be the basic template against which the afterlife teachings of world religions would need to be placed, in order to reveal the theosophical engagement with the ancient Egyptian material on these themes of death and the afterlife. I will present a number of readings from the Secret Doctrine, and I will then comment on them and explanation. Through these readings, various recognizable Egyptian terms and teachings will be shown in their theosophical context. Selected readings are an appropriate method to uncover the theosophical reading of ancient Egypt for the reason that H.P. Blavatsky's engagement is fragmentary. As with many religions, she interprets, there is no consistent engagement with a text or an idea. The purpose of the readings is to reveal the theosophical understanding/interpretation of the Egyptian material. Sections of the extracts may be examined in other chapters owing to the fact that more than one topic may be engaged with in a single passage. In addition, as the extracts can be lengthy, I will interject my comments and explanatory notes within the extracts. Inside brackets. 11. A few introductory comments may be useful to make the general theosophical position in the readings below more comprehensible. The readings deal with the afterlife realms wherein the deceased, in one form or another, will reside following life. Various Egyptian terms are used in theosophical writings, not always consistently, and it can become difficult to assign one interpretation to a particular term. 4 Egyptian terms referring to the afterlife/underworld in theosophical writings are Amenti, Anru, the Tuat, and Tiao. Amenti, the secret or hidden place of Amen. The entry in the expanded index to the Secret Doctrine lists afterworld as a synonym. This suggests it can be a general term, encompassing various afterlife states and locations. In the Secret Doctrine, the Amenti is often correlated to the Kama Loka, as a place of purification. The judgment of the soul is said to take place in the Amenti. Other statements appear to link the Amenti to the Theosophical Devachan. The Theosophical Glossary lists it as a general term for the afterlife or underworld. G. the Puraker, and the Encyclopedic Glossary, correlates it with the 15th division of the Tuat. The end of the entry in this source, however, suggests the term can be used generally to include the Kama Loka and Devachan. Anru, also Eru, Aru, Yaru, Honor, this is the Egyptian field of reeds. In the secret doctrine, it is a division of the Amenti, or afterworld. It is the domain of Osiris, wherein the deceased is given a portion of land. This is usually correlated with the Theosophical Devachan, and sometimes with the Kama Loka. The Theosophical Glossary lists Anru as a celestial field, and the second division of Amenti. The entry in the Encyclopedic Glossary essentially repeats that of the Theosophical Glossary. Tuat, this is a version of the Egyptian Duat. It is a general term for the afterlife planes and states. In this sense, it can be a synonym of Amenti. Amenti, however, can also have a more limited meaning when it is used in reference to a section of the Duat only. Tiao, this is a version of the term Tuat. It is the path of the night sun, which is the path of the sun after it sets and traverses the underworld. From the theosophical perspective, afterlife is perhaps a better explanatory term than underworld. The Kama Loka and Devachan, and any postmortem state, are located on the inner planes of the solar system or planetary chain. Once the physical plane is left, various inner states of consciousness are adopted. The selected readings may be easier to follow if section 5.3 is read first. 5.2.1 Selected Reading 1. In Egypt, the defunct man, whose symbol is the pentagram or the five-pointed star, the points of which represent the limbs of a man, was shown emblematically transformed into a crocodile, Sabak or Savek or seventh, as Mr. Gerald Massey says, showing it as having been the type of intelligence, is a dragon in reality, not a crocodile. He is the dragon of wisdom or manas, the human soul, mind, the intelligent principle, called in our esoteric philosophy the fifth principle. The reference to Gerald Massey is to be found in his lecture, The Seven Souls of Man and their culmination in Christ. 12 The broader context of the passage is to link the human being to the fifth range of the gods, those associated with mind. The fifth principle, or plane, counting from the bottom, is that linked with manas, microcosmically, or mahat, macrocosmically. The intent of H.P. Blavatsky here is to define the deceased into a being composed of the three higher theosophical principles, those which endure after death. These three principles are the higher manas, Buddha and Atman, says the defunct Osirified in Ch. Books 5, Book of the Dead, or the ritual, under the glyph of a mummiformed god with a crocodile's head. 1. I am the god, crocodile, presiding at the fear, at the arrival of his soul among men. I am the god crocodile brought for destruction, in allusion to the destruction of divine spiritual purity when man acquires the knowledge of good and evil, also to the fallen gods, or angels of every theogony. 2. I am the fish of the great Horus, as Makara is the crocodile, the vehicle of Varuna. I am merged in Zekton. This last sentence gives the corroboration of, and repeats the doctrine of, esoteric Buddhism, for it alludes directly to the fifth principle, manas, or the most spiritual part of its essence rather, which merges into, is absorbed by, and made one with Atma Buddha after the death of man. For Sekhan is the residence or loka of the god Kem. Horus Osiris, or father and son, hence the Devachan of Atma Buddha. In the ritual of the dead, the defunct is shown entering into Sekhem with Horus and emerging from it as pure spirit, 64:29. Thus the defunct says, v. 130, I see the forms of myself, as various men transforming eternally. I know this chapter. He who knows it, takes all kinds of living forms. Chapter 88 of the Book of the Dead, entitled A Spell for Assuming the Form of a Crocodile, reads, 1. I am the crocodile presiding over fear. I am the god crocodile at the arriving of his soul among the shades. I am the god crocodile brought in for destroying. 2. I am the Fish of the great Horus in Kemor. I am enveloped in Sekhem. Davis, 1894, page 117 or. I am Sok, within whom terror of him dwells. I am Sok, who carries off, by violence. I am the fish S of Horus, great in Athribis. I am lord of obeisance in Letopolis. Allen, 1974, page 74. Or. I am a crocodile immersed in dread. I am a crocodile who takes by robbery. I am the great and mighty fish-like being who is in the bitter lakes. I am the lord of those who bow down in Letopolis. Faulkner, 1972, page 84. While a little confusing with the correspondences, H.P. Blavatsky reads Osiris for Atman, father, Horus for Buddha, son, and the deceased is represented by the higher Manas. Individuality, these three making the full deceased in Devachan. H.P. Blavatsky is linking the three higher principles to the Devachan experience. After death, the individual would be reduced to the three higher principles, the higher aspect of Manas, Buddha and Atman, which would be experiencing the Devachanic state. Rebirth or reincarnation would reverse this process, in which the three higher principles radiate into the material planes and become the new person on earth. The first section of the quotation by H.P. Blavatsky seems more properly to refer to incarnating, arrival of his soul among men 13, rather than to the process of dying. By referring to the destruction of divine spiritual purity in the fallen gods, this seems clear. The crocodile was an ambiguous figure in Egyptian mythology, sometimes being associated with Seth, and sometimes seen as a protector. Sobek could represent fertility associated with the Nile floods, as well as royal power, and was eventually assimilated with the sun god Ra. In the context of this passage, the deceased may assume the form of a crocodile owing to its associations with power and the defeating of enemies. These are attributes the deceased would value as he negotiates the dangers of the afterlife. H.P. Blavatsky as Zekten, or Sekhem or Seken, as a synonym for the theosophical Devachan. Based on the interpretative move of place and order, this equivalence is sanctioned. For theosophists, Sekhem is equivalent to their Devachan, and the theosophical teachings associated with the Devachan could now be inferred in Egyptian teachings. H.P. Blavatsky is discussing chapter 64, Oksiv, of the Book of the Dead and mentions verses 29 and 130. Her reference to verse 130 appears to be an error and should read simply 30. As I understand this passage in its theosophical context, H.P. Blavatsky has the deceased in Devachan reviewing their various incarnations. It is a reference to the various lives of the individual and theosophical teaching of reincarnation. 14 in its Egyptian context. However, this passage has reference to the various potential transformations the justified deceased can undergo. The deceased, found innocent during judgment, has his full senses restored and becomes an Ak. Transforming into any living entity signifies the freedom that the afterlife brings. And in verse 35, addressing in magic formula that which is called, in Egyptian esotericism, the ancestral heart, or the reincarnating principle, the permanent ego. The defunct says, O my heart, my ancestral heart necessary for my transformations, do not separate thyself from me before the guardian of the scales. Thou art my personality within my breast, divine companion watching over my fleshes, bodies. I have discussed this passage in chapter 4. For H.P. Blavatsky, the reference is to reincarnation. In Egyptology, the heart is being weighed against the feathermont. The deceased is concerned that his heart may testify against him and calls for the heart to speak well of his life and to return to him so that he may become an effective deceased, an Ak. It is in Sekhem that lies concealed the mysterious face, or the real man concealed under the false personality, the triple crocodile of Egypt, the symbol of the higher Trinity or human triad, Atma, Buddha, and Manas. In all the ancient papyri, the crocodile is called Sebek, seventh, while the water is the fifth principle esoterically. And, as already stated, Mr. Gerald Massey shows that the crocodile was the seventh soul, the supreme one of seven, the seer unseen. 15 Even exoterically Sekhem is the residence of the god Chem, in Chem is Horus avenging the death of his father Osiris, hence punishing the sins of man when he becomes a disembodied soul. Thus the defunct Osiriphi became the god Chem, who gleans the field of Anru, i.e., he gleans either as reward or punishment, as that field is the celestial locality, Devachan, where the defunct is given wheat, the food of divine justice. In this passage H.P. Blavatsky continues her emphasis on the three higher principles residing in a Devachanic experience. Here Anru is equated with the theosophical Devachan. The deceased, in the form of his three higher principles, resides in the Devachan in the appropriate state of consciousness. One of the explanations of the real though hidden meaning of this Egyptian religious glyph is easy. The crocodile is the first to await and meet the devouring fires of the morning sun, and very soon came to personify the solar heat. When the sun arose, it was like the arrival on earth and among men of the divine soul which informs the gods. Hence the strange symbolism. The mummy donned the head of a crocodile to show that it was a soul arriving from the earth. 1988, Volume 1, page 219-221 in Egyptology, Chapter 5 of the Book of the Dead is a transformation spell. The deceased assumed the form of a crocodile and could inspire the same terror and all that crocodiles emanated towards the living. This powerful animal could destroy its enemies, and the deceased now appropriated these attributes. The crocodile is one of many forms into which the deceased could hope to transform. There are spells to transform into a phoenix, heron, swallow, and so on. Each expresses the desire for freedom of movement in the afterlife. 5.2.2 Selected reading 2. In footnote in The Secret Doctrine H.P. Blavatsky writes, Plus Anru is the domain of Osiris, a field divided into 14 sections surrounded with an iron enclosure, within which grows the corn of life 7 cubits high, the Kamaloka of the Egyptians. Those only of the dead, who know the names of the janitors of the 7 halls, will be admitted into Amenti forever, i.e., those who have passed through the 7 races of each round, otherwise they will rest in the lower fields, and it represents also the 7 successive Devachans, or Lokas. In Amenti, one becomes pure spirit for the eternity. 30. 4. While in Anru the soul of the spirit, or the defunct, is devoured each time by Uraeus, the serpent, son of the earth, in another. Since the primordial vital principles in the sun, i.e., the astral body of the deceased whore, the elementary fades out and disappears in the sun of the earth, limited time. The soul quits the fields of Anru and goes on earth under any shape it likes to assume. See Chapter 99. Book of the Dead, 1988, Volume 1, page 674 in this passage. H.P. Blavatsky equates Anru with the Kamaloka and Amenti with the Devachan. H.P. Blavatsky is making reference to various theosophical teachings here. Successfully passing through the 7 races of each 7 rounds would be the conclusion of human evolution. The individual would have completed human evolution and would no longer need to incarnate on earth. To enter Amenti forever is possible from the theosophical perspective only if human evolution is completed. One would no longer reincarnate. From the perspective of mainstream Egyptology, the passages mentioned refer to the freedom the deceased desires and achieves as an effective deceased, in Akhand-Ba. The deceased can assume any form they wish and have the freedom of movement to go anywhere they desire. The corn growing 7 cubits high will be discussed below. The essence of the statement from H.P. Blavatsky is the equating of the 7 cubits with the 7 principles. To be 7 principle would mean that the higher triad of principles has not withdrawn from the lower 4. It is, therefore, an inferior state to Devachan, namely the Kamaloka state she mentions. The conclusion of the passage and of H.P. Blavatsky in general is always in reference to reincarnation, particularly in the context of individuals who have not completed human evolution. This is an interpretative step not seemingly taken by the ancient Egyptians or modern Egyptologists. 5.2.3. Selected reading 3. In a lengthy passage from The Secret Doctrine, H.P. Blavatsky writes, "The Book of the Dead gives a complete list of the transformations that every defunct undergoes, while divesting himself, one by one, of all those principles, materialized for the sake of clearness into ethereal entities or bodies. We must, moreover, remind those who try to prove that the ancient Egyptians knew nothing of and did not teach reincarnation, that the soul, the ego or self, of the defunct is said to be living in eternity. It is immortal, co-eval with, and disappearing with the solar boat, i.e., for the cycle of necessity. This soul emerges from the Tiao, the realm of the cause of life, and joins the living on earth by day, to return to Tiao every night. This expresses the periodical existences of the ego." Book of the Dead, Kekslai. Again, the emphasis in this passage is on reincarnation. H.P. Blavatsky puts forward one of her interpretations of the transformations which are known from the Book of the Dead. These transformations are symbolical expressions of transformations the deceased experiences during the process of dying. 16 In the Encyclopedic Theosophical Glossary, the Tiao is the Egyptian duat, or underworld. De Pirucker, G. N.D., for H.P. Blavatsky. The cycling of the solar bark with the deceased in it is symbolical of reincarnation, the periodical existences of the ego. This is not the common understanding of Egyptologists, where the deceased joins the sun in his journey across the heavens and through the underworld on an endless journey through eternity. The deceased does not reincarnate on earth in a new personality. In Egyptology, the deceased comes forth by day, that is, leaves the tomb to wander as desired, but must return to the tomb and underworld every night. The shadow, the astral form, is annihilated, devoured by the Uraeus, Kslix, 51. The manes will be annihilated, the two twins, the fourth and fifth principles, will be scattered, but the soul bird, the divine swallow, and the Uraeus of flame, Manas and Atma Buddha, will live in the eternity, for they are their mother's husbands. Plus. The theosophical sense of this passage is clear in light of H.P. Blavatsky's comments inserted in brackets. The lower principles are either annihilated or devoured, while the higher, immortal human principles survive death. Chapter 149 of the Book of the Dead details the 14 mounds of the field of reeds through which the deceased passes on his journey to Osiris. Each mound is guarded by various entities with the intent of protecting Osiris from his enemies. It is the enemies of Osiris which are devoured by the cobras protecting him. Like alone produces like. The earth gives man his body, the gods, Dhyanis, his 5 inner principles, the psychic shadow, of which those gods are often the animating principle. Spirit, Atman, is one, and indiscrete. It is not in the Tiao. The Theosophical Glossary defines the Tiao as a kind of devacanic post-mortem state. 17. Blavatsky, 1990, page 334. The following passage suggests the Tiao is the underworld. In the Theosophical teachings, the Atmic principle remains on its high plane and cannot itself descend or embody. The divine principle is not in any form of manifestation. We have seen, however, in the Egyptian conception that the concept of total freedom of movement is paramount. The deceased in his various modes of existence is not to be restricted from any place. For what is the Tiao? The frequent allusion to it in the Book of the Dead contains a mystery. Tiao is the path of the night sun, the inferior hemisphere, or the infernal region of the Egyptians, placed by them on the concealed side of the moon. The human being, in their esotericism, came out from the moon, a triple mystery, astronomical, physiological, and psychical at once. He crossed the whole cycle of existence and then returned to his birthplace before issuing from it again. Thus the defunct is shown arriving in the west, receiving his judgment before Osiris, resurrecting as the god Horus, and circling round the sidereal heavens, which is an allegorical assimilation to Ra, the sun, then having crossed the Nut, the celestial abyss, returning once more to Tiao, an assimilation to Osiris, who, as the god of life and reproduction, inhabits the moon. Plutarch, Isis and Osiris, ch. 43, shows the Egyptians celebrating a festival called the ingress of Osiris into the moon. In chapter 41, life is promised after death, and the renovation of life is placed under patronage of Osiris Lunas, because the moon was the symbol of life renewals or reincarnations, owing to its growth, waning, dying, and reappearance every month. In the Dangmo, 4:5, it is said, O Osiris Lunas, that renews to thee thy renewal. And Safe says to Seti I. Mariottes. Abydos, Plate 51, thou renewest thyself as the god Lunas when a babe. It is still better explained in a Louvre papyrus, ppra, Etudes Egyptologiques, couplings. And conceptions abound when he, Osiris Lunas, is seen in heaven on that day. Says Osiris, O sole radiant beam of the moon, I issue from the circulating multitudes of stars, open me the Tia'u, for Osiris, and I will issue by day to do what I have to do. Amongst the living, Book of the Dead, ch. 2, i.e., to produce conceptions. 1988. Volume 1, page 227-228. This is a complicated passage owing to the various theosophical teachings alluded to. All life on the earth existed before in earlier stages of evolution. The immediately prior stage of evolution was on the moon. The various life waves had completed their evolutionary stage on the moon, which is now a dead planet, and incarnated on Earth to continue their evolutionary journey. The beginning of life and the awakening of mind on Earth form a substantial part of the theosophical teachings in Volume 2 of the Secret Doctrine. The intent of the passage remains, however, connected to reincarnation and re-embodiment. At the end of this passage, H.P. Blavatsky references Chapter 2 of the Book of the Dead. In Davis, the title of this chapter is, a chapter about coming forth by day and living after death. Instead of referring to reincarnation and a new life of earth, the passage expresses the desire of the deceased to continue life in eternity after death. The deceased as Abba and Ak expresses the desire to do what I wish on earth among the living. The deceased expresses the desire for total freedom of movement, including returning to the tomb in the land of the living, in any other place they may desire. In the Egyptian sense of this passage, it is not the sole theosophical monist principle, expressing an intent to reincarnate. It is rather the desire of the complete individual to have total freedom of movement with no restrictions after death. 5.2.4 Selected reading 4. The deceased is resplendent in his egg when he crosses to the land of mystery. 22. He is the egg of Seb, live. 1-3, the egg was the symbol of life and immortality and eternity. In Kircher's Oedipus Egypticus, Volume 3, p. 124, one can see, on the papyrus, engraved in it, an egg floating above the mummy. This is the symbol of hope and the promise of a second birth for the Osirified dead. His soul, after due purification in the Amenti, will gestate in this egg of immortality, to be reborn from it into a new life on earth. For this egg, in the esoteric doctrine, is the Devachan, the abode of bliss, the winged scarabaeus being alike a symbol of it. The winged globe is but another form of the egg, and has the same significance as scarabaeus, the kopru, from the root kopru, to become, to be reborn, which relates to the rebirth of man, as well as to his spiritual regeneration. Blavatsky, 1988, Volume 1, page 364-365. The essence of this passage is again the linking of the deceased with the concept of reincarnation. From the theosophical perspective, the egg in which the deceased resides is the Hiranyagarbha, lit. Golden egg. Barberka equates this in the anthropological context with the auric egg of the person. 1992, page 239. The deceased, in their three principal form, resides in the devachan, which as a state of consciousness is viewed as a form of the individual himself. In the afterlife, the deceased gestates and will be reborn, or reincarnated, back on Earth. This gestating in the egg recalls the theosophical text, the sleeping spheres, referred to earlier. The deceased, in their form of the three higher principles, lies resting in the devachan. Once the reward of devachan is over, the process of reincarnating begins. Chapter 22 in the Book of the Dead is entitled, Another Chapter About Giving Back His Mouth to the Man in the Netherworld. Davis, in part, translates this chapter as following. 2. I shine in the egg in the unseen world. They give me back my mouth to speak. 1894, page 87. Faulkner has. I have arisen from the egg which is in the secret land, my mouth has been given to me, that I may speak with it in the presence of the great God, Lord of the Netherworld. 1972, page 51. And Allen has. I have risen from the egg that is in the land of mysteries. My mouth has been given me, that I may speak therewith before the gods of the netherworld. 1974, page 36. All these passages have the deceased residing in an egg in the underworld. His mouth is open so that he may speak to the lords of the afterlife. The opening of the mouth ceremony reanimated the deceased and restored their senses. The deceased identifies himself with Osiris, so that they might participate in the desired resurrection into the eternal afterlife. Lurker, in his dictionary, gives one meaning of the egg as the inner coffin next to the mummy, an implied hope of an afterlife. 1994, page 48, the coffin itself represented the underworld and was accordingly decorated in such a manner. The general symbolism of life generated within an egg, and the deceased being reanimated in the coffin, may pertain. In Egypt it was hoped that the deceased would be able to leave the coffin, which itself was a magical entity. The coffin is then, so to speak, both the underworld and in the underworld. The deceased hopes to rise from the coffin, not to be reborn on earth, but to become an effective dead and live eternally in this new life in the company of the gods. The freedom the deceased desired could, however, include visiting the world, their tomb, etc. The symbol of the egg has multiple associations in both Egypt and in theosophy, not to mention in world religions in general. The main purpose of H.P. Blavatsky is to locate reincarnation and the seven principles in the Egyptian religion. That is, to locate the theosophical teachings in the Egyptian religion. 5.2.5 Selected Reading 5. In a passage referring to the sevenfold division of the human being, H.P. Blavatsky, in a footnote in The Secret Doctrine, comments. The Egyptian allegory in the Book of the Dead already mentioned, the hymn that relates to the reward of the soul, is as suggestive of our septenary doctrine as it is poetical. The deceased is allotted a piece of land in the field of Anru, wherein the Manes, the deified shades of the dead, glean, as the harvest they have sown by their actions in life, the corn 7 cubits high, which grows in a territory divided into 14 and 7 portions. This corn is the food on which they live and prosper, or that will kill them. In Amenti, the realm of which the Anru field is a domain. 4, as said in the hymn. See chap. 32. 9. The deceased is either destroyed therein, or becomes pure spirit for the eternity, in consequence of the 7 times 77 lives past or to be passed on earth. The idea of the corn reaped as the fruit of our actions is very graphic. 1988, Volume 1, page 236. In this passage, H.P. Blavatsky is chiefly concerned with locating the sevenfold division of the individual in Egyptian teachings and Buddhist teachings. From the passage we can understand that Anru is now conceived of as a division of the Amenti. The Manes are equated here to the Kama-rupic entities of the previously deceased. Barberka, 1992, page 401, the reward of the soul is in reference to the nature of the life lived on earth. Embodied life in the theosophical context is a realm of causes, and afterlife states are those of effects. Corn or wheat symbolizes the karmic fruit of one's actions. A good life will result in a positive afterlife. Experience in the Devachan. The reference to 7 times 70 lives is to that of the complete cycle of human existence. The cycling of the monad through 7 rounds on a planetary chain, normal human evolution, will result in the perfection of the sevenfold human entity. Each principle is unfolded in fullness. The state of human perfection can be achieved in an accelerated manner through the initiation schools. 5.2.6 Selected Reading 6. In a passage speaking of wheat, which H.P. Blavatsky suggests is not of this earth, she goes on to say, and let us bear in mind, in this connection, how sacred was that cereal with the Egyptian priests, wheat being placed even with their mummies, and found thousands of years later in their coffins. Remember, the servants of Horus gleaned the wheat in the field of Onru, wheat 7 cubits high. Book of the Dead, chap. 99, 33, and Clavy, 4. The reader is referred to stanza 7, verse 3, book I, wherein this verse is explained in another of its meanings, and also to the Book of the Dead, chap. 6, v. 4, and 5. This is a direct reference to the esoteric division of man's principles symbolized by the divine wheat. The legend which inscribes the third registrar of the papyrus, chap. cx. of the Book of the Dead, states, this is the region of the manes, disembodied men, 7 cubits high to wit, those just translated and supposed to be still sevenfold. With all their principles, even the body represented astrally in the Kamaloka or Hades. Before their separation. And, there is wheat 3 cubits high for mummies in a state of perfection, i.e., those already separated, whose 3 higher principles are in the Devachan who are permitted to glean it. This region, Devachan, is called the land of the rebirth of gods, and shown to be inhabited by Skio, Tefnut, and Seb. The region for the manes 7 cubits high, for the yet imperfect mummies, and the region for those in a state of perfection who glean wheat 3 cubit high, is as clear as possible. The Egyptians had the same esoteric philosophy which is now taught by the Cis-Himalayan adepts, who, when buried, have corn and wheat placed over them. 1988, Volume 2, page 374. The action again takes place in the Theosophical Kamaloka and Devachan. The phrase 7 cubits and 3 cubits is associated with beings of a sevenfold and threefold division of principles. The sevenfold beings, being in the lower state of the Kamaloka, while the threefold beings, being composed of the 3 higher principles only, are in a state of perfection, the wisdom tradition adepts. Once this identity is established, theosophical content can be read into the Egyptian text through the various interpretative mechanisms of theosophy. 5.2.7 Selected Reading 6. The 40 assessors who stand in the region of Amenti as the accusers of the soul before Osiris, belong to the same class of deities as the Lipika, and might stand paralleled, were not the Egyptian gods so little understood in their esoteric meaning. The Hindu Chitragupta who reads out the account of every soul's life from his register, called Agar Santani, the assessors who read theirs from the heart of the defunct, which becomes an open book before, whether, Yama, minus, Osiris, or Karma, are all so many copies of, in variants from the Lipika, and their astral records. Blavatsky 1988, Volume 1, page 104. We have a brief reference here to the Egyptian judgment of the dead by Osiris. H.P. Blavatsky also equates the theosophical Lipikas with the assessors. It is now possible for theosophical content to be inserted into Egyptian texts. It is not just a process of simply listing synonyms. Complicated theosophical content is injected into Egyptian texts. The Lipikas are beings, or cosmic energies, or karmic scribes who are associated with the recording of acts, thoughts indeed of entities. It is against this faithful karmic record that the deceased are judged. Through this true record of the individual, human or cosmic, the nature of the following incarnation is also determined. The judgment scene of ancient Egypt is perhaps the most famous concept of the ancient Egyptians, and in the theosophical context can refer to two events. The first is the natural law, judgment, by their own karma, of the deceased after death. The actions, deeds, and thoughts of the deceased are judged by the natural law of karma. If sufficient good karma had been built up during life, the deceased, i.e. as a three-principled entity, will enter the devachan. The second potential explanation of the judgment scene references the initiations. The lower principles of the living candidate are paralyzed, and the higher self enters the afterlife spheres. As a conscious entity, these two contexts and the actual processes involved mirror each other. Sleep is the third process which is related to these concepts. Mainstream Egyptology almost wholly rejects any mystery initiations in Egypt in the model of the ancient Greeks. A fine review of the situation is Naylor's Shamanic Wisdom in the Pyramid Text. 2005. He summarizes the issues and refers to the few Egyptian scholars who argued favorably for this mystery initiation interpretation. Eric Horning in his work The Secret Lore of Egypt, 2001, forcefully represents the mainstream view of the Egyptian religion. Theosophical writers insert theosophical content into religions of the world. An example of this, in reference to the judgment scene, can be found in Schiller's article, The Papyrus of Ani, Initiation in the Afterlife. 1982, for Schiller, the correspondences are, Mot-dash. Karma, Ab, Heart, Kama Manas, Lower Manas, Ka, Kama Rupa, and Ba, Soul or Mind, dash. Buddha Manas. In Schiller's reading, then, the deceased, or initiate, travels to the afterworld. Regions in an ethereal body, wherein the personality is judged. If the judgment is positive, the deceased will attain the consciousness state of the higher mind, the theosophical Buddha Manas. His article continues in this vein with various other minor correspondences. This type of post-Blavatsky interpretation ignores what I will call first and second level dissonance. First level dissonance refers to the incongruity between the writer's ideas and H.P. Blavatsky's work. Second level dissonance refers to incongruity between the writer and other commentators on H.P. Blavatsky's work. At issue is not whether Schiller's correspondences make sense, or are even theoretically true. At issue, on the first level, is the relation of the correspondences to the definitive, and varied, statements of H.P. Blavatsky. Any difference between Schiller's work and H.P. Blavatsky signifies an interpretation of the latter by the former. This raises questions of authority and the inaccessibility of the ancient wisdom tradition. The second level dissonance is also concerned with the first level and source writings. Ambiguity or inconsistency in H.P. Blavatsky's writings is reflected in later theosophical writings by different positions being taken. Once this happens, the science of theosophical positions begins to falter. 5.2.8 Selected Reading 7. From the Secret Doctrine. It is an expression peculiar to the latter, and as hazy for the profane as that of the Egyptians who called the same the day of come to us, plus, which is identical with the former, though the verb be in this sense, might be still better replaced with either of the two words remain or rest with us, as it refers to that long period of rest which is called paranirvana. As in the exoteric interpretation of the Egyptian rites, the soul of every defunct person, from the Hierophant down to the sacred bull Apis, became an Osiris, was osirified, though the secret doctrine had always taught that the real osirification was the lot of every monad only after 3,000 cycles of existences. So in the present case, the monad, born of the nature and the very essence of the seven, its highest principle becoming immediately enshrined in the seventh cosmic element, has to perform its septenary gyration throughout the cycle of being in forms, from the highest to the lowest, and then again from man to God. At the threshold of paranirvana it reassumes its primeval essence and becomes the absolute once more. Blavatsky, 1988, Volume 1, page 134-135. This passage is part of a commentary on a stanza from the Book of Zion, a section of which reads, "It is the ring called Pass Not, for those who descend and ascend, as also for those who, during the Kalpa, are progressing toward the great day be with us. 1988, Volume 1, page 129. H.P. Blavatsky is commenting on the phrase, "Great day be with us." Elsewhere in the commentating passage she references Pierre's French translation of the Book of the Dead, and quotes a sentence from chapter 17. The sentence is from chapter 17, verse 41 to 42, of the Book of the Dead, which in translation reads, 41, the day of, 42, come to us, is the day when Osiris said to the sun, come. I see him meeting the sun in the Amenti. Davis, 1894, page 80. Or, as for that day of come to me, it means that Osiris said to Re, come to me that I may see you. So said he in the west. Faulkner, 1972, page 48. What is H.P. Blavatsky saying in this passage? In essence, she is referring to the end of a planetary chain, solar system, or galaxy. To encapsulate, one might say she is referring to the end of the world. She makes a division between the manifest and unmanifest planes, between spirit and matter, and between the personal ego and the impersonal self, the latter on the microcosmic level. At the end of a cycle of manifestation, the manifested world is withdrawn back into its own inner source or higher self. H.P. Blavatsky interprets the sun as the origin and source of the manifested worlds. When the cycle of manifestation is over, the entities and worlds emanated by the sun are drawn into the state of paranirvana. Paranirvana, or paranirvana, 19 is state the monad achieves after a greater cycle of manifestation. In short, then, the monad, Atma Buddha, is absorbed by its parent and source, the sun. The individual is Osirified. Chapter 17 is one of the oldest and most important parts of the Book of the Dead. It encapsulates a great many concepts of the ancient Egyptians. I have quoted verse 42 from the Book of the Dead above. This section refers to a fundamental concept of the Egyptians during the Middle and New Kingdoms, where the sun god, Ra, and Osiris appeared to merge into one another. Osman notes that the call come can refer to death and to the call to the judgment of the dead, and the consequent resurrection. 2005, page 124, the solar and Osirian conceptions of the afterlife meet in this text. The sun god travels on a cyclic route, which every night includes a descent into the underworld of Osiris. During this journey the sun god unites with the mummified Osiris, who represents his corpse. This meeting revives Osiris, and renews and rejuvenates the sun god. Taylor explains that during this union the sun is to be seen as the Ba of Osiris, which is the mummified corpse. This is the model for the human Ba rejoining the mummy in the tomb. This meeting is a temporary union, and the sun continues the journey back into the day, and is reborn in the east. The cycle then continues daily for eternity. 20. It is difficult to compare the two readings. The context of each differs dramatically. Theosophy can, and will, fall back onto the esoteric/exoteric distinction, which allows for the insertion of theosophical content. The greater the reliance on this technique of insertion, however, the less convincing and powerful is the theosophical version. I also suggest that the more theosophists rely on esoteric interpretations, which do not bear scrutiny and ask for no supporting references, the further it moves from the spirit and intent of H.P. Blavatsky. H.P. Blavatsky hoped that her esoteric interpretation, being rational and true, would be taken up. Once fairly considered, it was to be an interpretation which was to make sense once fairly heard. 5.3 Death and Afterlife in Egyptology. It would be difficult to sum up the entirety of the Egyptian teachings on death and the afterlife in a few pages. The Egyptian religion covers a span of over 3,000 years with specific focus on these themes. Between the pyramid text, the coffin text, the later Book of the Dead, and contemporary texts of the underworld, there is an evolution of ideas in relation to the afterlife. In this section I intend to outline in very general terms Egyptian ideas on the afterlife. with emphasis on the Book of the Dead. The Book of the Dead is the primary Egyptian text. H.P. Blavatsky references in The Secret Doctrine. My main object is to sketch a picture which will allow a broad comparison with the theosophical presentation of the Egyptian afterlife and with the specific theosophical presentation of the afterlife. I will go into more detail on aspects specifically touched on by H.P. Blavatsky in the selected readings above. Two general comments can be made which help to orientate one to the Egyptian and theosophical perspectives. The first relates to the cult of the dead in the mortuary context of the Egyptian religion. This is almost totally lacking in the theosophical teachings on death and the afterlife. Salima Ikram's work Death and Burial in Ancient Egypt is a representative introductory mainstream book on these topics. The chapter headings from the table of contents are The History and Land of Egypt, Beliefs in the Afterlife, Mummification, Animal Mummies, Funerary Equipment, and Provisioning the Dead, the Tomb and Funerary, Mortuary Cults, and the Living and the Dead. Such is the broad scope of the Egyptian concern with death and the afterlife, excluding the first chapter, which covers the history and land of Egypt, the second chapter only in part. Of the last would have potential theosophical equivalents. There are no theosophical teachings on mummification, funerary equipment and provisioning the dead, or the tomb. The Egyptian concern with death revolves in a fundamental way around the mummy and its care. Theosophy, favoring the quick dissolution of the physical body, can have no comparable concern. 21 The difference is not simply one of emphasis. That is, it is not that the Egyptians emphasize one aspect of death and theosophy another. Theosophy fundamentally differs from the Egyptian text in its orientation to death and the dead. By dismissing the necessity for mummification, theosophy has separated itself from Egyptian teaching in such a way that I do not see how the difference between the two can be overcome. One cannot imagine the Egyptian religion without mummification, tomb cults in its mortuary context. These are not merely minor aspects of the Egyptian religion, rather they are at the heart of it. The second point is also telling, although on a different level. In Journey Through the Afterlife, Taylor notes that the Egyptians viewed human life as a series of transformations. Birth, growing up, parenthood, old age, death, followed by rebirth. 2010, page 16. What is important to note here is that rebirth in the Egyptian context meant being born into the afterlife. It did not refer to reincarnation on earth as understood by theosophists. While both Egypt and theosophy refer to cycles in nature, the context in this instance is very different. Reincarnation is a fundamental tenet of theosophy. Much as I struggle to imagine Egyptian religion without mummification, or theosophy with it, I struggle to imagine theosophy without reincarnation. It is the theosophical endeavor to locate teachings of reincarnation in the Egyptian religion, and most theosophical writers state that it is there. Mainstream Egyptology, though, has remained resistant to this idea. 22 I discuss the theosophical reading of reincarnation in the Egyptian religion in an appendix. In brief, the main themes touched on in the selected readings above would be the sevenfold constitution of the human being, the place/location of the afterlife realm, including the field of reeds, Anru and Amenti, the judgment scene and the weighing of the heart, the transformations of the individual, and the second birth and becoming an Ak, or pure spirit. With this background context in mind, I will outline the general Egyptian conception of death and the afterlife. 23. Broadly speaking, there were two main mythologies of death in ancient Egypt. One followed the journey of the sun god Ra, whom the deceased wished to join on his cycle through night and day, and the other was associated with the myth of Osiris and a journey to the underworld. A third goal the deceased, at least the pharaoh in early times, could aspire to was that of becoming a permanent star in the sky and live with the gods who were also conceived as permanent stars. The Egyptians also conceived of death in a variety of ways. Jan Osman in his Death and Salvation in Ancient Egypt has characterized these images of death as dismemberment, death as social isolation, death as enemy, death as dissociation, death as separation and reversal, death as transition, death as return, death as mystery and death as going forth by day. 2005, pg. 7, 9. This is an attempt by Osman to categories Egyptian conceptions of death. Death conceived as the dissociation of the parts of human individual is the perspective which has most in common with the theosophical presentation of dying. In Chapter 4 I have discussed the problems associated with the theosophical construction of the Egyptian conception of the individual. In general, the earliest Egyptian concern with death appeared to be for the king alone. Gradually in Egyptian history, ordinary/non-royal persons were included in the teachings of the afterlife. This gradual democratization involved the broadening influence and use of funerary texts throughout the general Egyptian society. Egyptians conceived of the universe as having three basic parts. There was the heaven and the sky, also associated with the watery expanse of primeval times. There was the land of the living, and, then, thirdly the underworld, or duat. Otherworld, netherworld, far world. Conceptions of the locality of the duat varied over time, and it could be beneath the earth, in the body of Nut, and in the west. The myth of Osiris is recounted in a late form by Plutarch in the 2nd century CE. In Egyptian texts there are allusions to this myth, though it is not recounted in the same detail as Plutarch outlines. Plutarch's work is a synthesis of elements of various potential Osiris stories and myths. That is to say, there was, perhaps, not one master narrative of this myth. In this myth, Osiris is king of Egypt, bringing various civilizing concepts to the country, for example agriculture. His brother Seth became jealous and lowers Osiris into a coffin which is cast into the Nile. The drowned Osiris is found by Isis, whereupon he falls back into the hands of Seth and is cut into 14 pieces which are scattered throughout Egypt. The body parts are recovered, barring the phallus, and Osiris is mummified and resurrected. He then becomes ruler of underworld. His son, Horus, having avenged his death on earth, becomes king of the earthly Egypt. Taylor. 2001, page 26-27. There are various political, economic, and social aspects to this narrative. These, however, do not overly concern us here, as this is not the level of interpretation on which theosophy works. The deceased Egyptian wished to become identified with Osiris owing to his successful conquering of death. Much of Egyptian mortuary culture revolves around the identifying of the deceased with the resurrected figure of Osiris. The deceased do not actually become Osiris. They become like Osiris and exist in his company, mirroring his survival of death. The other well-known myth associated the deceased with the sun god Ra in his journey through the day sky, his passing into the underworld, and his rebirth in the morning. This powerful symbol of the cyclic nature of things and of conquering death was a complex myth with many speculative aspects. The traveling of the sun through the night sky, or the underworld, was conceptualized in various ways. The sun could be portrayed as traveling through the primeval waters, as traversing the earthly depths, and passing through the sky or heavenly realm. This latter could be conceived as, for example, the body of a crocodile. The sun had to pass through a series of trials or gates, which represent the dangers associated with the afterlife. The forces of chaos conquered by the sun led to its being reborn every morning. The deceased, wishing to mirror this conquering of death and to gain eternal life, hoped to journey with the sun in his solar bark on this cyclic journey. Taylor, 2001, pg. 28-29, and later. Mortuary texts. The myths of Osiris and the sun god Ra become joined where the sun god encounters the mummified Osiris in the underworld, and, by merging in his corpse, Osiris is reborn. This became the motto for the union of the Ba and the mummy in funeral belief. There are variants of the myths, which existed side by side with one another. The essence of these myths, for our purposes, is the conquering of death and gaining of eternal life. The goal of funerary preparations and rituals was to assist the deceased to become an ineffective Spirit. This particular mode of existence was achieved only after the hurdle of death had been successfully negotiated. Not all the deceased achieved this state, which was dependent on a successful judgment after death and on the correct mortuary practices being carried out on their behalf by the living. Taylor in his journey through the afterlife outlines the various stages associated with death as expressed in the Book of the Dead. I will follow his outline closely in the sketch below. Death was associated with both magic and knowledge in ancient Egypt. The deceased required certain mortuary rituals to be done on his behalf, and he needed certain knowledge in the afterlife to negotiate the dangers successfully. Following death there was a period of grief, and the deceased was transferred to a place of embalming. Depending on what the deceased could afford, there were various mummification options. Wealthier persons could expect a longer, more complete mummification. The deceased was ritually mummified, the aim of which was to create an eternal body as a vehicle for the non-physical aspects of the individual. Part of the assimilation of the deceased into an eternal body was to identify the individual parts of the body with various divinities. The mummy itself was an indispensable part of the process, which aimed for the survival of the deceased. The mummy was returned to the family, and a procession to the tomb began. An essential ritual performed on the mummy was the opening of the mouth ceremony. This ceremony could not only reanimate the deceased, but also objects like statues, coffins, buildings, temples, etc. Taylor, 2010, page 88. It is essential that the deceased was reanimated, as he needed to perform certain functions and utter certain words to negotiate the afterlife successfully. Through this ceremony the deceased was returned to his senses, and the different modes of existence of the deceased were reconnected. The mummy was placed in the tomb with the requisite accessories and provisions. This could include food, texts to guide the dead, and so on. Offerings from the living were needed to support the ka which remained in the vicinity of the tomb of the saw. The deceased could leave the tomb in the form of the ba, to come forth by day, which symbolized the freedom of movement desired by the Egyptian in the afterlife. All constrictions of human life would fall away, while the afterlife became an idealized version of this world. It was essential that the deceased return to the tomb to accept and partake of the offerings. This would allow him to continue his existence in the afterlife. While the relatives of the deceased maintained and provisioned the tomb, the deceased had to begin negotiating the hazards of the afterlife. The ancient Egyptian religion evolved over time, which led to various teachings existing side by side. For example, possible outcomes of journeying through the underworld. The duat could be to dwell with Osiris, to travel through the duat with Ra, and to rest in the field of reeds, envisioned as a paradise. There seems to be no set uniform topography of the underworld presented in the Book of the Dead, and it is also not clear from the Book of the Dead where the various parts of the underworld were located. For example, the field of reeds. The deceased needed to negotiate various obstacles like gates, caverns, and mounds. These obstacles can be numbered in various ways in different texts, and even within the same text. 24 For example, chapter 149 of the Book of the Dead lists 14 mounds, while chapter 150 lists 15 mounds. Taylor, 2010, page 138. At the center of these obstacles is Osiris, with whom the deceased hopes to identify and partake in the life eternal. The obstacles to be overcome were in large part meant to protect Osiris from his enemies. They were not, then, specifically negative, or evil forces. Instead they were guardians of the deceased. The deceased overcame these obstacles through the use of magic and knowledge. These same tools were required for the deceased to maintain control of himself and of the elements. All aspects of the individual needed to be protected in the afterlife from the forces of dissolution and destruction. Specifically, the heart and the head were to be protected for the survival of the deceased in the afterlife. Various transformations of the deceased were envisioned, into a falcon, a hawk, etc. 25 These transformations symbolize the freedom of movement in the afterlife. The state of Osiris in The underworld could be conceived of as being static and constricted. The deceased wished for a freedom associated with exiting the constricting boundaries, bandages, of the mummy itself. This was known as the coming forth by day. The idea encompassed the breaking free of the underworld and entering the day, only to return to the underworld/tomb by night. This process mirrored the passage of the sun god through the celestial sky, into the underworld, and then reborn. The well-known judgment scene of Egypt is found in chapter 125 of the Book of the Dead. A form of judgment, however, is attested in Egyptian texts from as early as the Pyramid texts. Brandon, 1958, pg. Page 110. In the Hall of the Two Mots the deceased has his life reviewed by Osiris. To pass this judgment successfully they needed to show certain knowledge and make protestations of innocence, the negative confession. The heart of the deceased is weighed against the feather of Mot, which indicates that it is not just special knowledge which assures eternal life, but also conduct on earth during life. Correct behavior in harmony with Mot was the prerequisite for becoming an effective deceased. Importantly, should the judgment go negatively, the deceased would not pass into eternal life, but would pass to a creature which would devour them. This is the feared second death of the ancient Egyptians. A true death. Those in harmony with Mot would be declared Makeru or true of voice. Taylor, 2010, page 240. The hearts of the deceased would be returned to them, and they would be granted immortality. As one may expect, the afterlife has been characterized in various ways during the history of ancient Egypt. Among the ways the location was conceptualized were the primordial ocean, the underworld, and the heavenly realm of the sky. Horning, 1992, page 96. One destination of the deceased in the afterlife was the Field of Reeds. In the Book of the Dead, the precise location of the Field of Reeds is not clear. It could be in the sky or beneath the earth, or it could be in the east, where the sun god ends his nightly journey. Taylor, 2010, page 243. It was conceived as a paradise where the blessed dead resided. The landscape was lush, with waterways, full fields of crops, and so on. It was portrayed as a reflection of the early Egypt, with all its joys and none of its despairs. It was a perfect life, reflecting the earthly life of Egypt, where the deceased would have slave figures or substitutes who did the physical work that agriculture required. For this reason, various Shapti figures were presented in the tomb. Taylor quotes a section from a discovered Egyptian funeral text that sums up many of the Egyptian attitudes to the afterlife. It is worth repeating here. You come in, you go out. Your heart enjoyed the praise of the Lord of Gods. A good burial after revered old age. After old age has come, you take your place in the Lord of Life, the coffin. You come to the earth in the tomb of the West, to become indeed a living Ba. It shall thrive on bread, water and air. To assume the form of phoenix, swallow, of falcon or heron, as you wish. You cross in the ferry without being hindered. You fare on the water's flowing flood. You come to life a second time. Your Ba shall not forsake your corpse. Your Ba is divine among the spirits, Aku. The worthy Bas converse with you. You join them to receive what is given on earth. You thrive on water, you breathe air. You drink as your heart desires. Your eyes are given you to see. Your ears to hear what is spoken. Your mouth speak, your feet walk. Your hands, your arms have motion. Your flesh is firm, your muscles are smooth. You delight in all your limbs. You count your members, all their sound. There is no fault in what is yours. Your heart is yours in very truth. You have your own, your former heart. You rise to heaven, you open Duat. In any shape that you desire. 2001, page 35. It would be difficult to imagine a similar quote concluding a theosophical text on the afterlife. 5.4 An example. H.P. Blavatsky presents a set of interpretive keys by which one unlocks the esoteric, theosophical, content in religious texts. The extent to which the key fits any particular text may differ for various reasons. It is my contention that H.P. Blavatsky expected her hints to fit text and gain wider acceptance. The scattered and fragmentary nature of her work on any particular religion, however, and the sometimes inconsistent statements in her foundation books, means that many keys have not been fully tested in the field. Theosophists have yet to unfold H.P. Blavatsky's presentation in a variety of fields fully, and as such have yet to confront, at least publicly, many of the problems which will arise. As an example of this, we can take a brief look at chapter 105 of the Book of the Dead. Spell 105, spell for propitiating ends Ka for him in the realm of the dead. Hail to you, my Ka of my lifetime, behold, I have come to you, I have appeared in glory, I am strong, besouled and mighty, and I have brought to you natron and incense, that I may cleanse you with them, even this evil phrase which I have spoken, this evil impurity which I have done, and nothing has been imputed to me, because to me belongs that papyrus amulet which is on the neck of Re, which was given to those who are in the horizon. If they are white, I will be white, and my Ka will be like them, my Ka's provisions will be like theirs, having been weighted in the balance. May truth be uplifted to the nose of Re, my head being supported by it, for I am an eye which sees and an ear which hears. I am not a bull for butchery, and none shall have an invocation offering of me. Faulkner, 1972, page 101. H.P. Blavatsky has not given any specific interpretation of this chapter. I will focus, therefore, on the one aspect she has commented on in separate contexts, the Ka. The context is that of the deceased, who has been positively judged, now greeting his Ka. The Ka of the deceased left the individual at death and preceded the deceased into the afterlife. It rested there waiting for the deceased. The justified deceased now wishes to reunite with their Ka. The Ka here is presented as a protective spirit, double, and as a life-giving and sustaining force. Janik, 2003. Page 194, Osman, 2005, page 100. To go to one's Ka means in this context to have successfully overcome death, and to join with the life-giving qualities in eternity. A new life in eternity is now expected. H.P. Blavatsky divides the individual into 7 principles. In theory, one of these principles should correspond to the Ka. I see 2 potential interpretive problems from the theosophical perspective. The first is that the Ka has more than one quality associated with it. It is both a double and a life-giving force. Secondly, depending on which theosophical principle it is correlated with, the events in the verse takes place in the afterlife, following death. It is difficult to pin down H.P. Blavatsky's precise correlation. From Table 6, it can be potentially the Linge Zarira or the Prana principle. The Egyptian Ka concept appears to include both of these principles. This is the first problem. Theosophy and the Egyptians had conflicting conceptualizations of the individual. The theosophical compartmentalized view and the Egyptian monistic conception are in basic conflict. The second problem is that both the Linge Zarira and Prana principle dissipate after death. These are temporary principles which are not aspects of the true individuality out of embodiment, and they have no role in the post-mortem states of the deceased. In the passage, the deceased is meeting their Ka after death in the afterlife. I can think of possible theosophical responses, but for the purposes of this dissertation, I do not want to go beyond what is stated by H.P. Blavatsky herself. Even if explanatory comments were offered, however, as they are not mentioned by H.P. Blavatsky, and might even be at odds with what she has written, there will be questions of authority to be overcome. 5.5 Conclusion. The theosophical context of death and dying differs dramatically from that of ancient Egypt. The cultural setting differs such that comparison is hardly possible at this level. It is instructive to look at a work like Ikrim's Death and Burial in Ancient Egypt. Even a superficial glance at the table of contents reveals the fundamental differences in emphasis. Ikrim's work has 7 chapters, 1 on the history of Egypt, 1 on beliefs surrounding the afterlife, and then 5 on mummification, Human and animal, the tomb, provisioning the dead and the cult of the dead. As theosophy basically rejects mummification, it has no need for mortuary cults, tombs. Funerary equipment, in provisioning for the dead. The only level of comparison possible is the doctrinal level in terms of the beliefs associated with the afterlife. This doctrinal level is the level at which theosophy operates in its interpretive movement. Underlying it is the implicit understanding of theosophists that their teachings are essentially scientific and factually true. In terms of the specific teachings relating to death and the afterlife, there are two fundamental hurdles in the theosophical interpretation. Firstly, the theosophical conception of the individual differs markedly from that of the ancient Egyptians. Secondly, theosophical conceptions of death always culminate in reincarnation. Reincarnation is not a basic concept found in the Egyptian texts. The broader the level of comparison, the closer the apparent synergy would be between theosophical and Egyptian concepts. Theosophy, however, presents a concept-specific constellation of beliefs. Theosophy rarely remains at the general level of comparison. The more detailed a concept, the more difficult it is to insert without conceptual problems. Theosophical interpretation can be complex and detailed. It does not simply insert its teachings irrespective of the source material being interpreted. It seeks various entry points to read itself into a text. These insertions are most easily uncovered when the larger context of a teaching or belief is taken into account.